Jack Thornton had memorized every word of Catherine's letters, all 17 of them. Standing on the wooden platform of Redemption Station, he clutched the latest one in his calloused hands, reading it for the 100th time. "I'll be wearing a blue dress with white lace," she'd written in her careful script, "and I'll be carrying my mother's Bible. I cannot wait to begin our life together in the West." The afternoon train was late, as usual, and Jack's heart hammered against his ribs like a wild horse fighting a corral. At 34, he'd finally gathered the courage to answer that advertisement in the Boston newspaper, finally dared to believe that a woman like Catherine, educated, refined, kind, might actually choose a life with a simple Wyoming rancher who smelled more of cattle and leather than cologne and civilization. The whistle screamed across the prairie, and Jack straightened his Sunday vest, the only nice clothing he owned. His ranch hand, old Pete, had laughed at him that morning while he'd bathed in the creek for the 3rd time that week. "She ain't gonna care if you smell like soap or saddles," Pete had wheezed. But Jack cared. Catherine deserved a man who tried, who made an effort, who could offer her more than dust and hardship. He'd scrubbed the ranch house until his knuckles bled, planted wildflowers by the porch, and practiced saying romantic things to his bewildered cattle. Now, as the train lurched to a stop with a great hiss of steam, Jack felt his throat go dry. Passengers began stepping down, a banker in a fine suit, a family with squalling children, an elderly couple moving slowly. But no woman in a blue dress. No Bible. No Catherine. Then she appeared. A woman descended the metal steps with a carpetbag in one hand and something else in the other, not a Bible, but a gun belt, which she slung over her shoulder with practiced ease. She wore a blue dress, true enough, but it was faded and travel-stained, and instead of white lace, there were patches sewn with rough thread. Her dark hair fell loose around her shoulders, wild and uncombed, and her eyes, gray as a winter storm, swept across the platform with the alertness of a hunted animal. She was beautiful, Jack noticed with a start, but it was a hard beauty, like a diamond formed under crushing pressure. When her gaze landed on him, something flickered across her face. Fear. Recognition. She walked toward him with long, purposeful strides that had nothing of Catherine's described delicacy. "Jack Thornton." Her voice was low, almost hoarse, as if she wasn't accustomed to speaking softly. Up close, Jack could see a fading bruise along her jawline and the way her hand instinctively moved toward her gun belt when a loud noise erupted from the station house. This wasn't Catherine. Every instinct told him so. But she knew his name, and she was wearing blue, and there was something desperate in those storm cloud eyes that stopped his questions before they could form. "Yes, ma'am," he heard himself say, his voice catching. "I'm Jack Thornton. Welcome to Redemption Station." Her name was Rose, she told him as they rode in silence toward his ranch, or at least that's what she wanted to be called. She didn't explain about Catherine, didn't mention the letters or the carefully described Bible or any of the promises that had been made. She simply sat beside him on the wagon bench, her carpetbag on her lap and her eyes constantly scanning the horizon as if expecting pursuit. Jack didn't push. He'd grown up in a land where people came west to escape their pasts, where asking too many questions was considered poor manners at best and dangerous at worst. But his heart sat heavy in his chest, a stone of disappointment weighing down every hope he'd built over 6 months of correspondence. When they reached the ranch, Rose stood in the yard for a long moment, staring at the small house with its fresh coat of whitewash and the wildflowers blooming defiantly in the harsh prairie soil. Something in her expression cracked, just slightly, like ice beginning to thaw. "You did all this?" she asked quietly. Jack nodded, suddenly embarrassed. I wanted her to feel welcome. Her hung between them, the ghost of Catherine who would never arrive, and Rose looked away quickly, but not before Jack saw moisture gleaming in her eyes. "It's real nice," she whispered. "Nicer than anything I've seen in a long time." Over the following days, an unspoken agreement formed between them. Jack didn't ask about Catherine or why Rose had come in her place. Rose didn't offer explanations, but she worked, Lord, how she worked. She wasn't like any woman Jack had ever known. She could handle a rifle better than most men, ride a horse like she'd been born in the saddle, and patch a fence line with efficiency that left old Pete shaking his head in admiration. But it was the small moments that confused Jack most. The way Rose would stop in the middle of mucking out a stall and stare at the mountains as if seeing beauty for the first time. How she'd found his collection of books, a modest shelf of classics and poetry, and read by candlelight each evening with an hunger that suggested starvation of the mind, not body. The morning he discovered her crying silently over his battered copy of David Copperfield, tears streaming down her face as she traced the words with one finger. "Are you in trouble?" Jack finally asked one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of amber and rose. She didn't answer immediately, and he thought she might ignore the question entirely. Then, so quietly he almost missed it, yes. Just that single word, heavy with 1,000 untold stories. Jack took a breath, choosing his next words carefully. "Anyone coming after you?" Rose's hand moved to her side, where she still wore her gun belt even in the house, even at dinner, even while reading. "Maybe. Probably." She turned to face him, and in the dying light, her eyes held a fierce, frightened pride. "I ain't who you were expecting, Mr. Thornton. I ain't refined or educated proper. I can't pour tea or play piano or do any of those things a mail-order bride is supposed to do. I'm a wanted woman, and I got blood on my hands, and you deserve better than a liar and a thief sitting at your table." The words spilled out of Rose like a dam breaking, how she'd been married young to a violent man, how she'd run after he'd beaten her unconscious and left her for dead, how she'd survived by becoming what the territories demanded, hard, armed, and ruthless. She'd fallen in with the Garrett gang, not because she was evil, but because they'd offered protection and purpose when she'd had neither. She'd robbed stages and banks, yes, but never killed anyone, never hurt anyone who didn't try to hurt her first. Then came the job that changed everything. They'd stopped a train, and while the gang was terrifying passengers and looting the mail car, Rose had found a woman hiding in one of the compartments. Catherine. Sweet, terrified Catherine, clutching her mother's Bible and crying about the fiancé waiting for her in Wyoming, the new life she'd been traveling toward. She looked so scared, Rose said, her voice breaking. And I saw myself in her, you know. How I'd been before everything went wrong. Before I became this. She gestured at herself, at the gun and the hard edges and the walls she'd built. The gang, they were going to, they had plans for her. Awful plans. So I made a choice. Rose had created a distraction, firing shots and screaming about pursuing lawmen, causing enough chaos for Catherine to escape into the prairie darkness. But the gang discovered the deception, and Rose had barely escaped herself, stealing Catherine's carpetbag in the confusion. Inside, she'd found the letters, all 17 of Jack's letters, carefully preserved and smelling faintly of hope and honest work in the kind of future Rose had stopped believing in. I know it was wrong, Rose continued, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. I know I should have just let her go and run the other direction. But I read your letters, Mr. Thornton, and they were so kind, so decent, and I thought maybe I could pretend, just for a few days. Maybe I could see what it felt like to be the kind of woman someone like you would wait for at a train station with wildflowers planted and a clean house and hope in his eyes. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the porch boards. I'll leave first thing in the morning. The Garrett gang, if they're tracking me, they won't think to look here for long. I've put you in danger just by coming, and you don't deserve that. You don't deserve any of this. Jack sat in silence, processing everything. His mail-order bride was gone, escaped into the prairie, hopefully safe. In her place sat an outlaw woman with a price on her head and a gang of criminals possibly tracking her trail. It was a disaster. It was dangerous. It was nothing like what he'd planned. And yet, as he looked at Rose, at her fierce, frightened, hopeful face, Jack realized something that knocked the breath from his lungs as surely as a fall from a wild horse. Somewhere between the train station and this moment, between her reading his books and working his ranch and crying over the wildflowers he'd planted for someone else, he'd fallen completely, irrevocably in love with her. Not with the idea of her, not with Catherine's refined letters and proper grammar, but with the real woman standing before him, damaged and dangerous and desperately trying to be better than her past. "I don't want you to leave," Jack said, standing to face her. Rose stared at him as if he'd spoken a foreign language. "Didn't you hear what I said? I'm wanted. I'm an outlaw. I've stolen and lied and you saved Catherine when you could have let her suffer," Jack interrupted. "And you've worked harder in 2 weeks than anyone I've ever known. And you read poetry by candlelight and cry over stories about orphans finding homes, and you look at my mountains like they're the most beautiful thing you've ever seen." He took a step closer, his heart racing. "You think I wanted a mail-order bride because I needed someone refined? I wanted someone real, Rose. Someone brave and strong and honest about who they are. You're more real than anyone I've ever met." Before Rose could respond, the thunder of hoofbeats echoed across the prairie. Both of them turned toward the sound, and Rose's hand flew to her gun. 5 riders crested the hill, silhouetted against the rising moon, and even at a distance, Jack could see the hard set of their shoulders, the deliberate way they rode. The Garrett gang. They'd found her. Rose's face went pale but determined. "Get inside," she ordered Jack. "Lock the doors, hide in the cellar. I'll lead them away from, no." Jack surprised himself with the firmness in his voice. "This is my land. My home. And you're under my protection now." He grabbed his rifle from inside the door, checked the ammunition, and positioned himself beside Rose on the porch. She looked at him with something like wonder. "You can't fight my battles, Jack. This ain't your—" "Yes, it is," he said simply. "Because you're mine now, if you'll have me. And I don't let anyone threaten what's mine." The gang rode into the yard, their leader, a scarred man with cruel eyes named Pike Garrett, dismounting with theatrical slowness. Well, he drawled, little Rose found herself a protector. How sweet." He spat tobacco juice into Jack's carefully tended wildflowers. "You killed 2 of my men when you ran, girl. Made me look foolish in front of the whole territory. I can't let that stand." Rose lifted her chin, though Jack could feel her trembling beside him. "They were going to hurt that woman on the train. I'd do it again." Pike laughed, a sound like rocks grinding together. "I'm sure you would. But I'm afraid your righteousness ends tonight. Now, you can come quiet, or we can kill your farmer friend first and make you watch. Your choice." What happened next would be told and retold in Redemption Station for generations. Old Pete, who'd been watching from the barn, fired the first shot, not to kill, but to alert the neighbors. In the territories, a gunshot in the night meant trouble, and within minutes, lights began appearing across the prairie as ranchers grabbed their weapons and rode toward the sound. Jack and Rose held their ground on the porch, firing carefully, buying time. Rose's accuracy was devastating. She shot the gun from one man's hand, winged another in the shoulder, all while shouting warnings instead of kill shots. "She could have killed us," one of the gang members would later tell the sheriff, his voice full of confused awe. "She had us dead to rights 6 times, but she just kept telling us to leave, to ride away, that it wasn't too late to make different choices." By the time the neighbors arrived, 12 armed ranchers who'd grown to respect Jack Thornton's quiet decency, the gang was surrounded. Pike Garrett, seeing the odds, made a desperate lunge toward Rose, but Jack was faster. He'd never shot a man before, had never wanted to, but his bullet found Pike's gun hand with the same careful precision Rose had shown. No killing, just stopping. The sheriff arrived with the dawn, and the whole story came out: Rose's involvement with the gang, her rescue of Catherine, her flight and attempted redemption. Jack stood before the lawman and the assembled community and made a speech he'd later barely remember, words flowing from his heart about second chances and the courage it takes to change, about how the West was built by people running from their pasts toward better futures. This woman saved an innocent life at great personal cost, Jack declared, his arm around Rose's shoulders. She's worked my land, protected my home, and showed more character in 2 weeks than most people manage in a lifetime. If you want to arrest her, Sheriff, you'll have to arrest me too, because I intend to marry her by week's end, and I won't have my wife in a jail cell. The crowd murmured, opinions divided, but then old Pete stepped forward, hat in his weathered hands. I've known Jack Thornton for 20 years, the old ranch hand said. He's the most honest man I've ever met. If he says this woman deserves a second chance, that's good enough for me. One by one, the neighbors nodded their agreement. The sheriff, a practical man who'd seen enough genuine evil to recognize courage when it faced him, made a decision that bent the law but honored its spirit. The territorial judge is a reasonable man, he said slowly. Especially when a community speaks with one voice. Miss Rose, you'll need to testify against the Garrett gang, and you'll be under house arrest here on the Thornton Ranch until the trial. He paused, a slight smile tugging at his mouth. I suspect Mr. Thornton won't object to keeping an eye on you. 3 months later, Rose Thornton, legally married, legally pardoned for her testimony that put away the Garrett gang for life, stood on the same platform where Jack had once waited for a woman who never arrived. This time, she was the one waiting, her heart pounding as the afternoon train pulled into Redemption Station. Catherine emerged from a passenger car, safe and healthy, her mother's Bible clutched in her hands. She'd sent a letter weeks ago, asking to visit the ranch, to meet the woman who'd saved her life and the man whose letters had offered her hope during her darkest moment. The three of them sat on Jack's porch that evening, Jack and Rose on the swing he'd built, Catherine in the rocking chair, and talked about fate and second chances and the strange paths that lead people to where they're meant to be. You know, Catherine said with a gentle smile, I've met someone in Denver. A shopkeeper, kind and patient, who makes me laugh and never asks me to be anything but myself. I think maybe we were all waiting for the wrong trains. She looked at Rose with warmth and gratitude. But sometimes the wrong train takes you exactly where you need to go. After Catherine left the next morning, Jack and Rose stood in their yard, looking at the wildflowers now growing wild across the property, no longer carefully contained to one small plot but spreading freely across the hard prairie soil. Rose leaned into Jack's embrace, marveling at the journey that had brought her here, from outlaw to wife, from running to standing still, from believing she was beyond redemption to finding it in the most unexpected place. Do you ever regret it? She asked quietly. That Catherine never came. That you got me instead. Jack kissed the top of her head, breathing in the scent of soap and sunshine and the woman who taught him that love isn't about perfect letters and careful plans, but about seeing someone's full truth and choosing them anyway. Every day I thank God for wrong trains and blue dresses and the courage it takes to become who you're meant to be. And there, in a place called Redemption Station, two souls who'd been waiting for different futures discovered that sometimes the greatest love stories are written not by fate or planning, but by the brave choice to be honest, to be kind, and to believe that everyone, deserves a second chance at becoming their best self. The wildflowers continued to spread, tough and beautiful and thriving in harsh soil, proof that even in the hardest places, with enough hope and care, anything can bloom.